Household carbon emissions account for roughly 1/3 of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and their levels differ substantially across different places. Households in suburban and rural areas have higher emissions than those in urban areas, and, overall, there is wide variation in emissions at the neighborhood level. Households in neighborhoods 1 standard deviation above the mean emit, on average, nearly 2 times more than those in neighborhoods 1 standard deviation below the mean. These spatial patterns suggest that one way to lower overall emissions would be for higher emissions places to adopt the features of lower emissions places, features such as dense housing and high-quality public transportation. But the effectiveness of such an approach depends on whether these observed differences are driven by differences in people or places. Are low emissions places low emission because of features of their urban landscape? Or are they simply populated by households who would have low emissions regardless of where they live? This paper tackles that question by decomposing variation in household carbon emissions into a component driven by household characteristics and a component driven by place effects. This is the amount by which the same household's emissions would differ from place to place purely due to differences in the underlying features of those places. Accounting for observable household characteristics such as income, education, and number of children does little to change these spatial patterns, so the question is how to disentangle the remaining variation in emissions, which reflects some combination of place effects and differences in unobserved household characteristics such as levels of environmental consciousness. To do this, the author leverages a longitudinal panel of energy use for over 1 million individuals from 20 years of restricted access census data. She links individuals over time and across places, and estimates how household carbon emissions change when the same household moves from one place to another. If spatial differences in emissions are driven by differences in household characteristics and preferences, then moving should have little effect. But if spatial differences are driven by place effects, then emissions should change when a household moves from high to low or from low to high emissions places. Crucially, the level of detail available in the census data makes it possible to account for changes in observable characteristics that might affect both a mover's choice of destination and their level of emissions, and, altogether, the data track over 250,000 movers across roughly 1,000 cities and over 61,000 neighborhoods. The results show that place effects do have a meaningful effect on household emissions. On average, when households move to a new city, their emissions change by about 85% of the mean difference in emissions between the origin and destination, and, at the neighborhood level, the analogous figure is 53 to 60%. This figure shows that these estimates are symmetric and linear for moves with varying sizes of origin-destination differences in mean carbon emissions. In other words, the share of spatial differences in emissions that can be attributed to the role of place is consistent for moves from low to high emissions places, those from high to low emissions places, and those between places with similar levels. Note, these results account for the impact of any observable changes in household characteristics, but unobservable changes can also be problematic. If, for example, a shift toward greater environmental consciousness induces a household to take many actions, including a move from a high emissions place to a low emissions one, then the results may overestimate the role of place by attributing the entirety of the resulting decline in emissions to place effects. While she is unable to rule out this possibility entirely, the author does show that restricting to households with minimal observable shocks, under the assumption that they are also less likely to have experienced large concurrent unobservable changes, has little impact on the baseline results. As a second approach to gauging the influence of place, a variance decomposition exercise indicates that city effects explain 14 to 16% of the overall variation in household carbon emissions, while neighborhood effects explain roughly 22 to 23%. This figure shows how the estimated place effects are correlated with various features of the urban landscape. Higher emissions neighborhoods tend to be less urban and dense, with poor walkability, bikeability, and public transit options. They feature a higher proportion of detached and larger homes, with households owning more cars on average, and, importantly, they have harsher climates and less clean electricity. While these latter conditions are more difficult to influence at the local level, even after excluding them, neighborhood effects still account for around 15% of variation in household carbon emissions. This suggests that there is the potential for place-based climate policies to have a meaningful impact on emissions. These are policies that change the underlying characteristics of the places people live in, and, as an illustrative example, the author uses her estimates to examine how carbon emissions would change if households currently living in suburban or rural areas instead lived in a place with the average place effect of their nearest principal city. This captures, in spirit, the impact of regulations that limit urban sprawl and encourage upzoning and infill development, and would result in an estimated 15% decline in household emissions. To put this number in context, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, which is the largest federal effort to address climate change to date, is expected to decrease economy-wide emissions in 2030 by 15%. And so, this paper concludes that place does matter for household carbon emissions. Exploring which specific interventions result in the largest changes to place effects is an important area for future work. To read more on this topic, you can check out the paper's references to other related work. This includes research on spatial differences in carbon emissions, their relationship to local amenities, and the efficacy of place-based policies more broadly.